In the quiet corners of New England, where the trees whisper and the wind carries stories long forgotten, lies the sleepy town of Salem, Massachusetts, a name forever etched into the faint echoes of early American memory, not for its triumphs or glorious battles, but for a peculiar series of tragic misunderstandings and deeply buried fears that culminated in what we now call the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. And though it has been told in classrooms and whispered through documentaries and dramatizations, what remains mostly untouched is the slower, more mundane details, the ones that feel too boring to retell, yet somehow hold the greatest power to lull us into reflection, or perhaps into sleep. The events that transpired in Salem were not born of action and adventure, but rather of long winters, idle minds, cold churches, and a theocratic order that sought to define reality through the lens of scripture and suspicion. It began, as many uneventful things do, in a small wooden meeting house surrounded by frost-bitten fields and a populace weary of harsh seasons, poor harvests, and the invisible threats they believed surrounded them. The Puritans, you see, were not a particularly cheerful people. They wore simple clothes, ate plain meals, and avoided colorful displays. Their sermons were long, often stretching into hours of solemn warning against sins most people today would consider harmless. In such a rigid atmosphere, the children of Salem, especially young girls, lacked stories of magic and dreams, so perhaps it was no surprise that when their imaginations were sparked by the enslaved woman Tituba, who told tales from her Caribbean past, those stories took root. The Reverend Samuel Parris, owner of Tituba, led a household where religion hovered like fog, thick and silent. His daughter Betty and niece Abigail began behaving strangely in the early weeks of 1692. Convulsions, fits, speechless crying. The town's doctor, lacking any better explanation, declared the girls bewitched. Now, in a town starved for explanation and steeped in religious paranoia, this was all the fuel needed. And so accusations spread. Slowly, boringly, they spread. From one neighbor to another, from child to adult, from servant to master. Names were spoken in whispers, then in court. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who hadn't attended church in months, and Tituba herself, who confessed under pressure, perhaps to escape harsher punishment, or perhaps simply to appease those who asked her questions she had no right answers to. It is important to remember that the trials weren't grand spectacles. They were slow, filled with testimony about dreams, strange behavior, livestock dying, butter turning sour, mundane phenomena woven into supernatural fabric. Court days were filled with readings of scripture, dry questioning, and endless testimonies that blurred together like days in a foggy winter. Bridget Bishop was the first to be executed. Her tavern and bright clothes had always drawn suspicion. Others followed: Rebecca Nurse, Martha Carrier, and George Burroughs, a former minister, accused of being the devil's right hand. These were not witches with potions and cauldrons, but common folk, dragged from their homes, questioned without representation, sentenced without credible evidence. And all the while, the town trudged along. The bakery still baked, the cows still needed milking, people whispered, but returned to work. Trials continued through the summer. More than 200 people were accused, 30 found guilty, 19 hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with stones for refusing to plead. His last words, it is said, were "more weight." And yet the town moved slowly on, burying its guilt as the seasons changed. In October of that same year, the governor, spurred by growing public unease and pleas from ministers outside the frenzy, put a stop to the court. The damage, however, had been done, not just to the families of the accused, but to the moral fabric of a town that had allowed fear to override fairness. But what is most forgotten is not the hysteria
or the injustice. It is the daily life that surrounded it. The school children still practiced their hornbooks. The elderly still mended clothing by candlelight. The woods still crackled with dry branches underfoot. The sun still rose over Salem's harbor. There was no dramatic turning point, no fire or revolt, just the slow realization, like the dawning of morning light, that something had gone terribly wrong, and nothing could undo it. Years passed. In 1702, the trials were declared unlawful. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring rights and offering restitution to some of the families. In 1957, Massachusetts formally apologized. And still, Salem remained. Today, it's a tourist town where witches are sold on T-shirts and ghost tours walk the cobbled streets. But the truth of 1692 remains far quieter, far more boring. It is the story of how fear and boredom combined in a town too isolated to know better, and how belief, once twisted, can lead to the slow unraveling of justice. And so now, as you listen to the gentle rhythm of this forgotten tale, know that there were no monsters under the bed, only neighbors across the fence. There were no curses, only cold winters, no spells, only stories told in candlelight. Let your breath fall gently now. The history is over. The town is quiet. The leaves rustle faintly above the empty graves, and all that remains is the stillness of old America, forgotten, yet remembered, where the truth is neither terrifying nor exciting, only slow and silent, and finally at rest.